Great, thank you very much, and good morning. So for the next, there we go. For the next just under 15 minutes, I'm going to be talking a bit about the epidemiology of HIV and STIs among sex workers. So this comes as good timing in terms of we just released yesterday a Lancet follow-up to the series. So in 2014, there was a Lancet series looking at HIV and sex work. And this review that we released yesterday is with the Lancet series authors, lead authors of the series, really looking at where the epidemiology is in terms of HIV for sex workers, and as you can see from the title, really the unmet actions. So where are those gaps in terms of implementation science? As part of this, we updated the global burden of HIV among female sex workers to the end of 2017. And what you see from this map is that the global burden of HIV really remains largely unchanged from 2011 and 2014 estimates. So the global burden of HIV for female sex workers currently is at 10.5% prevalence. And this is really largely unchanged, as I said, from 2011 estimates. We continue to see significant variation both across and within regions, not just by epidemic structures, so the epidemiology of HIV, prevalence among clients, but also by structural and contextual features of HIV. As you can see from this slide, the highest HIV burden continues to be among sex workers female sex workers within Eastern and Southern Africa, as well as Western and Central Africa. I'll just touch briefly on, although much of the work that we have available is among female sex workers, there is a small but emerging research among trans women sex workers as well as male sex workers. So since 2014, we've seen 18 studies among trans women sex workers, and a lot of this work is actually led by my colleague who will be speaking shortly on transgender populations. However, small sample size and conflation of men, MSM, and trans women really continue to hinder our ability to look at the experiences of trans women sex workers. There has been some progress in terms of male sex work data, and in particular 22 studies since 2014. However, both HIV and STI prevalence for MSM really varies by the relative population. So we continue to see that where male sex workers who professionally sell sex have a lower or equivalent burden of HIV, whereas MSM who sell sex often have higher burden of HIV. Another important factor that we're continuing to see is that really 2 decades into the anti-prostitution pledge around PEPFAR, sex workers really are largely uncounted in both HIV and other STI surveillance. So this is largely due to many of the same structural factors that are potentiating epidemics, so stigma, criminalization, as well as a lack of political and financial investment. And this lack of denominators, so lack of having these STI prevalence data, which you could see from the earlier map, really hinders our ability to look at scale and reach of interventions and prioritize target populations. We also see that sex workers have been largely invisible within much of the generalized HIV epidemic within high burden settings. So particularly in southern and sub-Saharan Africa, and work by Mishra and colleagues found that between 5 and 20% of new HIV infections in sub-Saharan Africa were amongst female sex workers. At the same time, an important context, which I'll speak to more in terms of our understanding of social and structural factors, is that human rights advances continue to be limited, and many settings have actually been rolled back by a wave of end demand criminalization, which is largely targeting clients or the end demand of sex work. So in terms of the epidemiology of HIV and other STIs, sex workers' risk of both HIV and other STIs continues to occur within context of powerful structural constraints that really vary by regions, but within local context, by multiple contexts. And I really want to go through some of those factors. In the absence of really addressing these factors, though, we're just not seeing the same reach in terms of advances in terms of HIV and biomedical interventions and public health interventions. So we now have a number of socio-ecological or structural models that look at what are the pathways to both shared pathways of HIV and other STIs. And what these models really help us to understand is those dynamic pathways between some of the upstream structural factors. So this is one example from our work, but there are many others, including work from Sevgi and Blanchard, as well as Tim Rhodes' group. What this really shows us is that some of those factors, so macrostructural, community organization or empowerment, and work environment factors, are upstream factors that are having that are interacting both within themselves, but having dynamic interactive pathways to sexual networking and dyad factors. And much of the early epidemiology of both HIV and STIs among sex workers has focused on those dyad and social networking factors. So we know that high concurrency of partners, as well as dense networks, are really shaping and driving both HIV and STI epidemics, but we're only just beginning to understand how some of the upstream factors are shaping those epidemic structures. So when we reviewed data looking at HIV, STI outcomes, as well as combined STI, HIV outcomes, and condom use, what we see is some of the factors that are really driving at the most high-level macrostructural are criminalized and punitive laws and policies, stigma, food insecurity, and other housing instability, as well as gender inequities and sex trafficking. At the same time, in terms of factors that are mitigating HIV and STI epidemics, we see gender empowerment, higher education, and literacy as really factors that are continue to mitigate HIV epidemics. We also see a complex pathway whereby migration and mobility are having both potentiating and mitigating epidemics. In terms of the community organization factors, there's increasing research looking at broad process of community empowerment, as well as specific aspects of community organizing, so drop-in centers, peer sex work, led outreach, and how those factors are mitigating HIV epidemics. In 2014, we saw that community empowerment had a threefold increased protection in terms of consistent condom use with clients, as well as 32% reduction in odds of HIV infection. Unfortunately, still in 2017, 2018, most of this data is coming from South Asia, and particularly the huge financial and political investment in terms of Avahan project, as well as the Songachi model. And we're really still only seeing some examples emerging from other settings. Some important work from Swaziland echoed this work in terms of social cohesion being a key protective effect in terms of condom use. But again, most of this data really continues to be limited to one setting, and it's largely due to both a lack of financial investment and political investment in scaling up community empowerment interventions led by sex workers. The work environment factor, and this is where really data is still very much in its infancy, we do see important factors in terms of both violence, policing, as well as suboptimal access to safe and appropriate HIV and STI testing, healthcare more broadly, as well as condom use as key drivers of both HIV and STI risks. At the same time, we're also seeing some important work in terms of supportive work environments and how those are protecting against HIV and STIs. And these look at policies in terms of within safer work environment venues, as well as third-party models. In terms of what we know of structural interventions, so when we modeled looking at the potential of structural interventions alongside behavioral and biomedical interventions, what we ultimately saw was that decriminalization of sex work through its joint addressing of violence, policing, as well as safer work environments could have the largest impact in terms of reducing HIV epidemics over a 10-year period. Since this work, there's also been two important ecological studies, one particularly focused on STIs. So in Rhode Island, there was a legal loophole that allowed decriminalization of sex work for an 8-year period. And what they saw was, in fact, a reduction in both gonorrhea and chlamydia incidence rates among both sex workers and the general population. Another important ecological model looked at across 27 European countries. So while there hasn't been a huge progress on the policy front, we are seeing some important research in terms of how these models can be rolled out. One notable progress was Amnesty International, who over 2 years of consultation ultimately endorsed decriminalization of sex work alongside UNAIDS and the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. However, we continue to see rights really roll back in many settings, including Canada and my country, where end-demand models targeting clients have evolved over the last few years. In terms of other implementation challenges, since the launch of the global markers, both in terms of fast-tracking the global response as well as sustainable development goals, new data on HIV care continuum and early interventions, including HIV and STI self-testing, as well as early ART, really are impeded by many of the same structural constraints. And I just want to note some of the key progress that we have seen. So there have been some advances, including the Sapphire trial in Zimbabwe, as well as in Uganda, or South Africa, where we've seen some important rates in terms of higher ART retention. However, the majority of work has really seen, despite the higher acceptability and feasibility of many of these biomedical tools, so HIV and STI self-testing, early ART, what we continue to see is high drop-off rates at 6 and 12 months. And much of this is related to implementation challenges, so fears of breach of confidentiality, violence, as well as other side effects. So in terms of 3 decades into the HIV epidemic, we really still have limited data both characterizing HIV and STI epidemiology. And as you saw, the HIV burden remains largely unchanged. I think the huge gaps remain in terms of our science of understanding how some of those structural and community features are impacting both HIV and STI epidemics. So while we had important progress in the early stages of the epidemic in terms of understanding some of the behavioral and biomedical tools, we still have very limited understanding of how those interact with many of the structural and community responses. There's also growing science in terms of how criminalization fails to protect sex workers, but also exacerbates both STIs and HIV, and it's important progress in terms of those ecological models, but we really need more complex epidemiology and evaluation of interventions as they're rolled out. So thank you.